I think some would have taken that view. Another interesting quote I found came from, maybe I can. If I turn around, can you still hear?
Yep.
Okay. Because some churches define their religious missions as including obligations to speak out on and attempt to influence public affairs, we hold to do so as part of their constitutionally protected religious liberty. The state may not deny or limit that right. Neither may it require that a church give up its right to free exercise of religion under the First Amendment to be eligible to gain a statutory privilege, for example, tax exemption. That was stated by Dr. James Wood, the Baptist Joint Committee on Public Affairs, 1976. How many have heard of the Baptist Joint Committee on Public Affairs before? Many of you have. Southern Baptists funded them. Things do change. I couldn't agree more with Dr. James Wood and the statement he made there. They used to say some things we agreed with. They began to say increasingly things that we could not agree with, and Baptists took their money away from the Southern Baptists, from the Baptist Joint Committee, and gave them to a new agency with a new assignment. It was a new agency, but the new assignment was the Christian Life Commission. When Dr. Richard Land was hired, he was tasked to use the BJC's money to advocate Southern Baptist convictions on religious liberty, family life, abortion, and so forth. But we agreed with Dr. Wood and the Baptist Joint Committee when they advocated this principle, that the right to speak freely about the application of Bible truth to issues of life, call it public policy, is part of our religious freedom right under the First Amendment. We are not putting our nose into the tent of government. Government is putting its nose into the tent of the home and the church and our communities and our ministries, and when they do so, we have the right to address every issue that government seeks to try to regulate or control or influence, on which the church ought to have a position. But in spite of these historic roots of absolute principled conviction about religious freedom of speech, I get the call from the Baptist layman who thinks if you talk about life and what the Bible says about life, and we should support candidates who support life, that we've risked our tax exemption. And for some ministries, I heard James Dobson say once, if it ever gets to the point that I've got to stop talking about public policy issues from a biblical perspective, I'll just turn in my tax exemption. And he's found other ways where he could do some political activity and has his own political action committee and so forth. But Baptists have been willing to fight, not just give up on the principle of religious freedom to preach and speak, even on public policy and political issues. And yet we're faced, the reason for the confusion by this good layman from Tennessee that called me is because of a law. Not quite so clear as thou shalt not kill. This law, it's section 501c3 of the Internal Revenue Code, says this. And on your quiz, I've got it on the back of your quiz as well. We'll refer back to it here a little bit later. But it says, corporations, the following organizations are exempt from taxation. Corporations and any community chest fund, blah, blah, blah. Just skip all that part. Go down to the underlined part. It says, no substantial part of the activities of which is carrying on propaganda or otherwise attempting to influence legislation, except as otherwise provided in subsection H, in which does not participate in or intervene in, including the publishing or distributing of statements, any political campaign on behalf of or in opposition to any candidate for public office. Here is the source of the confusion. Congress has adopted this statute, but it's not defined the terms. It says your church can engage in trying to influence legislation. They can do that, as long as no substantial part of your ministry budget or your time or energy is spent on trying to influence legislation. Somebody says, so how much is a substantial part? Well, we don't tell you. Well, can you give me $1 of it? No, we don't have to tell you. We know it when we see it, and if it's too much, we'll let you know. What does it mean to intervene or participate in a political campaign? We're not going to tell you. would you please, we'll tell you case by case. You get in trouble, you do something wrong, we'll tell you then, but until then, we're not going to define the terms in advance. That's why people are confused. That's why people are fearful. And that's why organizations like the ACLU in every election year begin their mailing campaign to churches, pastors, and ministry leaders saying, it's that time of year again where somebody's going to tell you you need to talk about public policy issues and political candidates. And we want to advise you that we're going to be watching your church carefully, that we'll be looking for people violating the law, Code Section 501c3, that says thou shalt not get involved in politics in the church. And they grossly overreach in their explanation of what they say the law prohibits. They're very narrow on what they say that your church can do and what is permitted by this code section. And their propaganda is false. But we need to have some understanding what the law is and recognize it is an ambiguous statute. We can't give you crystal clarity, but there ought to be some reassurance to know that it's never in all its history been enforced to deprive a pastor of the right to stand in the pulpit and say, thus saith the Lord, even if he points his finger at the president or at Caesar. So some people just tell me when they call me for legal advice, Mike, just tell me the law. Give me a simple rule to follow. What is the rule to follow here? And I tell them, bad news, it's not always that clear. It ought to be like the speed limit. The posted sign, what's the speed limit? It's easy to drive the speed limit if you tell me what the speed limit is. These turkeys won't tell us what the speed limit is regarding tax exemption traffic way. What's the limit? Well, speed laws are normally pretty clear. But even they sometimes aren't. Sometimes I'm driving from the country and the sign says 70 miles an hour. And I get in a different area and it says 65 miles an hour. And then sometimes I'm driving back to Kansas City and I know somewhere that 65 mile an hour limit drops to 55 and somewhere it may be 40, 45. They vary, especially as you get to populated areas, and I may have missed the sign and I drive through some section of the state wondering, I wonder what the speed limit is here. What's your temperament when you're not sure what the law is? 35 miles an hour. I want to make sure I'm safe. I don't want to take any chances. 35 miles an hour. Little old lady from Pasadena, I'm whizzing by her around the street trying to get home in a reasonable time while she goes 35 miles an hour because she hadn't seen the speed limit sign lately. But I'm whizzing down at 70 miles an hour. And I see a crowd of cars and some car off in the distance pulled off in some little farm field. Can't tell, is that something red on top of that, or is it just a luggage rack? What is that thing? I begin to slow down, looking for the speed limit. Circumstances affect the way I drive, but I'm willing to take a little bit of risk to get home in time. I try to go what I think is the allowable limit, try not to go over the limit, but following the tax exemption laws because of this ambiguity might be likened to traveling down tax exemption traffic way with some ambiguous signs being posted. But we have two basic rules before we look for what the signs are. We have two rules on political activity from the code. Number one, lobbying is permitted with some limitations. Candidate campaign participation is prohibited. No exceptions. That's our general rule. We'll talk about those in some detail here. Note, the rules apply to the church, not to individuals. Your outline begins by saying an organization is exempt. This is talking about organization activity and organizational exemption, and so it doesn't apply to individual activity unless that person is acting in his official capacity for an organization. It applies to churches, not to individuals. It applies to official action by the church. It applies to action by an agent or a spokesman of the church. It applies to use of church resources. Rule number one on lobbying. Lobbying is permitted with some limitations. No substantial part of the activities is influencing legislation. No definition of substantial or influencing legislation. Rule 2, candidate campaigns. Thou shalt not participate, intervene, publish, distribute statements in political campaign or for or against a candidate. Those are the 2 rules. No definition of participate or intervene. So what's the speed limit? 55, 65, 70. And then you've got the little radar every now and then that reminds you you're going a little bit over the 25 limit here, going through Pretty Prairie. You need to slow down to avoid getting a ticket. But we're talking about having to practice preventive law. My advice to churches, ministry organizations, pastors, people involved in ministry, is you need to have the principle, like driving and practicing preventive driving, you need to practice preventive law in the area of tax exemption compliance. And you're not always going to know exactly what the speed limit is. It's not always clearly posted based on these statutory ambiguities, but we can have some sense based on those 2 basic guideposts I've given you. And so I've now handed out for you a quiz. I want you to think through with me a dozen applications of these 2 basic principles. We've talked primarily about the issue of no campaign candidate participation or involvement. What does that mean? On your outline, point number 1 is Pastor Doe tells his neighbor, I'm voting for Smith. How many think that is safe? Under America's law today, you can still say, I'm voting for Smith. That's right. You can check mark safe there. Pastors still have a right of free speech. Ministers have the right of free speech. They have the right to their opinions and their political opinions, and they can tell a friend or a neighbor, I am voting for Smith. You can put over in the margin here my rating on this. What's the miles per hour for that comment? 40 to 45 miles an hour. I think you're going pretty slow. You're slowing me down. When all you're wanting to do is say, well, I'm voting for Smith. Safe or risky? I think it's safe. Quick quiz number 2. Pastor Doe says from the pulpit, the church does not officially endorse candidates, but I am voting for Smith because I believe his position on X issue is biblical. How many think that's safe? Raise your hands. How many think that's risky? Raise your hands. 45 to 50 miles an hour in Mike Whitehead's preventive law guide. I check mark safe. Why? Pastor Doe, it says the church does not officially endorse a candidate. That's called a disclaimer in the law. It's always better if you have any doubt, disclaim. If you think somebody's going to be confused that I'm up here speaking for the church. The deacons told me what to say. It was past a church business meeting. I'm here announcing the church's position is we're voting for candidate X. That's different. Where Pastor Doe says, I'm not officially condoning or I'm endorsing candidates, but I am voting for Smith because I believe his position on X is biblical. That kind of preaching from the pulpit, even naming names, but tying the name to a biblical principle, it's never caused a church or a pastor to lose the tax exemption. IRS won't touch that. Why? Well, they say, well, it might come close to violating this statute. This is a Congress-passed statute that is subject to a higher law, the First Amendment of the Constitution. That statute could be void if it's applied to say that a pastor can't stand in the pulpit and say, for me and my house, we're going to serve the Lord and the life principle, I'm going to vote for John Doe. If it comes to the point we'll give up that right, then we've traded in our religious liberty heritage for a bowl of tax exemption pottage. But it's got more risk than the first comment because it happened in the pulpit. So you're going faster than just the pastor who says to his neighbor over the backyard fence, I'm voting for Smith. You get in the pulpit where you're on the job, you're on the payroll, and the church is providing for tax-exempt microphone, tax-exempt electricity, tax-exempt lights. But you say, but I'm saying the church has paid for all this, and I'm standing up here telling you this is not on behalf of the church. The church is not paying me to say this. And if you want to make me stop, I may be willing to give up my job to save my conscience, that I'm not going to stop telling the Word of God that I think this is wrong, this is right, and this candidate has done wrong. I'm not going to support him. Or this one has done right, I am going to support him.